My name is Brown Yau, and I have a PhD in somatic depth psychology. My work is to work with people who are suffering, I would say, with trauma. And all kinds of people come in to see me, and sometimes they come in because, maybe they're going through a divorce, maybe they had a car accident, maybe they're having some kind of psychosomatic symptom. Doctors can't find any organic cause. What is very common often is gastrointestinal disorders. So they're coming in to sort of say, I'm suffering with something, something's going on, I'm not really quite sure what it is. Or it might be the car accident, or it might be, my boyfriend hit me. Can we work with that? Because it's really interrupting the flow of my life. And so we sit down together and we begin an exploration. And the way that I work is I don't have an agenda. I really am following what the person is letting me know what they would like to explore. And then we go from there, and it can be a very organic process. It's a very courageous process of the person who comes in to deal with their trauma. And sometimes it can be a short period of time where somebody is, resolving, let's say, the car accident or the surgery that was traumatic. And quite often, or I would say 99% of the time now in my work, is we uncover something much deeper than the person was initially coming in for. And this takes a little bit of a longer time to untangle, if you will. And it typically will go all the way back to childhood trauma or infant trauma. And of course, people don't always know they had trauma when they were young because there's a dysfunction of their hippocampal processing, which prevents what happens to us coming into explicit memory. And so it stays in the body as implicit memory or unconscious memory, and stays alive, if you will. These traumatic experiences of infancy or childhood stay alive with us in the body. We can be very much aware of them and start to shout out in many ways as adults. And somehow these people will find the way to me to work with it, whether they knew it or not. I would say one way of doing it is to allow an image to emerge, or quite often a metaphor will spontaneously emerge. And these images and metaphor really touch into the emotional truth of the body and can convey in very exquisite ways the really the emotional truth of our childhood, of what might have happened a long time ago but is still very, very present with us. And image and metaphor, as well as gesture, actually, any kind of gesture is a wonderful way just to feel, especially if it's something, an archetypal gesture you often see people do and they don't quite know they're doing it, to just ask them to pause and to feel that and to notice what happens inside as they feel it. That's one way of accessing. Sometimes an image or a metaphor will come from that. But what these processes are doing are touching into our body. So we call them right brain processes. And the right brain is very connected to the body. And so is the left brain. It's very much a whole brain, whole body process, but these processes specifically allow us to touch into the body in a way that we can assimilate it, in a way that it's not overwhelming and it's not, re-traumatizing. So there's some ways. Sometimes we begin with sensation, just noticing sensation. But a lot of time people aren't aware of sensation because they've numbed from their body. On the other hand, some people are so exquisitely aware of every sensation that just touching into sensation isn't particularly useful. It just goes around and round and round. I'm feeling this, and I'm feeling this, and then this, and then this. So a very integrative process is needed where, yes, sensation, yes, image, yes, metaphor, yes, our cognition, insight, all of these as they come and go and flow out of each other, weave us back together where we may have fragmented or dissociated. I think yes and no. Sometimes, traumas can be what we call the unimaginables, so severe, so devastating, that a person has no interest in trying to heal it. It's just too painful and too overwhelming. Mostly I think we can now, given the right support, in the right environment, and the right amount of time. Not that time does anything, but we do need to have time to learn how to process what might have happened to us. I've worked with people in some of the most, severe traumas. In our culture, in America, where I'm working, I hear a lot about child abuse and physical abuse, all kinds of violence. But I also work with people from other cultures that are just as horrific. People who were born in a time of a war, which obviously happened in America also, but whose cultures may have been taking them to whippings or beatings as part of an initiation into that culture. So all kinds of trauma, and I see people come through it, and that's really the only way I can do what I do, to sit day after day with people in profound suffering and to not see any kind of movement would maybe be a little bit overwhelming, for my own being. But I see this profound shift in people that happens sometimes quite dramatically and sometimes more slow over time, that really brings great joy into my being in doing this work. But I also really feel and know that, and I don't say this lightly at all, it's just coming up right now, so I'm going with it, that when I'm sitting working with someone and I'm listening to such profound suffering, I go there with them. I'm not afraid to feel and be part of what they're sharing, and I think that's one of the most important parts of healing trauma, is to not feel like you have to feel it all yourself. Because that's what happened originally, in childhood or as a teenager or whenever these original events happened. It felt so alone, so terrifying, and it can be too much to go back there by oneself. So if somebody's working with a therapist, and they have really profound, early, horrifying trauma, it would be very useful, healing, to work with somebody who can either navigate those places because they've gone there themselves, or, not everybody will have been able to go there themselves because it just didn't happen, or someone who can drop into those places of terror and rage and fear, and not have their own material be triggered, that we can stay very calm in a field, I say field of compassion, and the compassion really always holds what's happening in a room, in this intersubjective space between two people. And that's kind of what the healing space. My background is when I was 17, I'll just give you the very condensed version. When I was 17, I came to America. It was a very exciting and fantastic time of my life. I came from England, but it was also a very traumatizing time of my life. I had one specific traumatic event, but then going back to England was also very traumatizing because my family had gone and my home had gone. And basically it was just too much to feel. And I would sit and I would go, this is too much, There was so many emotions. And simply I didn't have the capacity at that time to feel all of that. Your home, your family, really being swept away and having no direction or idea of where you were going to go in the world. But what I did have was this innate knowing, that I call it, to sit down and to get quiet and to go inside. And I did that. I was 17, 18. And something extraordinary happened for me that put me on a path of exploration and curiosity all the way up until now. So as I sat down and went quiet inside, this might sound a little strange, my crown opened up. And I could experience this fabulous, immeasurable space that was so loving, but not in a loving way that I would ordinarily receive, from my parents or my friends or know myself. It was a very quiet, yet saturating presence of love. And I had no framework or understanding of what this was. I wasn't in a spiritual community. I'd never read any spiritual books. It was just this instantaneous opening. And what it did was make me go, what on earth is that? I want to understand what that was. And I had no idea which way to go to find that out. Where I was in England, as far as I knew, there was no communities, or I just didn't hear it talked about. So I just continued to sit. And I would just sit down, I'd get very quiet, I would go inside, I would just notice my breath, I would notice my body, and here would this space open up. And I was talking to a neuroscience recently about this. We were sharing some stories, and they said, well, you just completely wired your system at that young age still by meditating to allow yourself to continue on the path that you did in a very embodied way. So that got me very interested in a spiritual journey that eventually led me to teachers. As I got older, obviously I wanted to seek people out. I came back to America. I was fortunate to find some very brilliant teachers who gave oral teachings that you actually won't find written down, who were able to see and understand where I was in my own spiritual practice and give me the next instruction of practice. And so I would do that, and had some very profound states of being open up that I integrated. And it was phenomenal, changed my whole life in great ways. One of the ways it changed it was to realize that compassion is suffering, and suffering is compassion. In a non-conceptual way, I think if we take that and conceptualize it in any way, it's almost meaningless. But the direct realization of that, and that's when I chose to work with trauma rather than be more on the side of talking about spirituality. Because all of a sudden I realized I can be in a very traumatizing space and see it as a suffering that it really is. I don't think we should deny that suffering is real at all. But at the same time, know it is a manifestation of compassion or of spirit itself. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And it's just not true. And it hasn't been my own experience. It hasn't been the experience of anybody that I've worked with, and I've worked with spiritual teachers. So my own experience, of opening up to these beautiful realizations and non-dual awareness and so forth, it didn't touch one of the largest traumas that I had in my life. It still remained in my unconscious until a couple of years ago. I had no idea. And I'd done both a tremendous amount of spiritual work and a tremendous amount of psychological work, both. And I had no idea. And just some events that happened, up it came. It came up in a tremendously violent way. Violent meaning the rage, this murderous rage that came up into my body. If I hadn't had the spiritual background that I'd had, I wouldn't have been able to contain it in the way that I did. The way that I contained it is as this rage moved through me, I was able to move my body more slowly. I was able to know that something very terrifying was happening in the moment. And, it was very big and it was very overwhelming. And I spent the next 2 years, up until pretty recently, working on it, integrating those energies of rage and terror, reintegrating those back into my system, and re-regulating my nervous system, if you will, because it almost wiped me out. Thank God I could have compassion. It could hold. I was held in compassion. I felt myself being held in compassion with it. But it was crazy, And as deep and as profound as some of the realizations I've had, it softened it, allowed it to hold it when I remembered it, but it didn't dissolve it. Non-dual awareness is not a solvent for trauma. It can help hold it. But I think there's also an idea that there's something wrong with trauma if we are awake or aware. There's something wrong with anger or aggression. And aggression is a natural, expression of our being. And there's healthy and unhealthy ways of being able to express it, of course. And I think by working with our traumas, we can find healthy ways to express that aggression, and to accept it, and to not see it as not a part of us, but as a part of our whole being, a part of the human experience that's really important, and to embrace it. So, maybe we are not just our body, but we certainly inhabit our body, and our body is full of consciousness, and our own individual consciousness is imbued with the body and consciousness. What happens in a lot of trauma, especially early trauma, is there's a disconnection of ourself, our individual or finite self. We could also call it our soul or our essence. That dissociates in the face of trauma because it feels like a life threat. And the body is what is feeling this terror, and it's so intolerable, it's so unbearable. This young being, this young soul has to disconnect. And that can be hidden in the unconscious for a lifetime. And, it relieves a lot of immediate distress to do that. And the individual who is traumatized becomes then more focused on surviving. And they may go very much into intellectual pursuits or go into their, cognitive capacities as a way of numbing from the body. But we can do the same with spiritual path and spiritual realizations. And they become a way of not having to deal with the body, right? We are not our body. But also a way of not having to connect with the interpersonal world in a very deep and profound, and connected way. And we don't even know we're not doing that. Some people feel that they're very connected, can be one with everything. But sometimes that core self is still hidden, dissociated in the unconscious. And the defense systems that surround that are brilliant. I'm always surprised at the brilliance of the body and brain and mind to protect this innocent part of us so we don't go anywhere near it. Because when the splitting occurs, there's always more than one sort of splitting that's happening. These defenses can come up, and this is fascinating to me, that are very demon-like. And there can also be defenses that come up that are very angelic-like. And we don't want to go near these demonizing defenses. Were very, very frightening. Sometimes they appear in dreams, sometimes they come up as images if we feel the body, and we want to move away from it because it's so terrifying. If we can find a way to stay with those in a very safe way, at some point they'll metamorph into something much more life-sustaining. And then we can integrate that part of dissociated energy that felt, for whatever reasons, needed to become really, really scary. It has elements of self-hatred in, quite honestly, quite often. And then we can work with these lovely, innocent, angelic parts as well. But we need to work with both. We need to work with both the darkness and what seems like darkness and light, or what seems like light. and bring them both together, these energies come back into the body. The dissociated affect and emotions can flow back into the body, and then the body becomes a safe vehicle because the nervous system begins to re-regulate itself. We have a greater capacity to feel, and so then this essence or our soul can indwell back in the body. And then from this perspective, then if we open up to non-dual awareness, wow, right? The brilliance of all form and formlessness at once, this magnificent display, is very accepting of everything that then arises within us. You know, the bad moods, the good moods, the anger, the sadness, the grief. There's just a lot less identification with it. So we can play in the field of the whole spectrum of human emotions without it, you know, weighing us down or judging ourselves. Absolutely, yeah. And the resolution of trauma is a great spiritual path, I would call it, a path of awakening, a path of freedom or a path of liberation. At the very least, it's a path of coming back to our body and our being. Because not everybody's interested in going beyond just what's right here, right now, as a physical dimension. But what we do when we heal trauma is we're bringing back our vibrancy, our aliveness, you know, we're bringing back our life force, because anything that we dissociate, we're dissociating part of our being, right? When we gather these parts of our being and bring them back, right, we're bringing back our life force, right? Our life force is our spiritual energy, you know? So it's always a very, what we would call a spiritual experience, however anybody interprets that. To not everybody it's going to have anything to do with non-duality. It might just be a presence of peace, of joy, of aliveness in those moments that allows them to transform in ways that they hadn't previously even imagined, and to live their life in a way that what I always hear from people is a life of joy, a life of service, a life of giving, a life of being able to receive, all of that. You know, for something that's very open and life-sustaining and life-giving. I probably would never give any advice, but if somebody asked me and was curious, you know, what is this thing about trauma? I don't have any because I'm in non-dual awareness. That's a good question, because I don't know. I don't think it's any of our places to tell people, hey, you know, you want to look inside and see if there's trauma, because not everybody may want to do that. They, you know, but on the other hand, I would say it is worthwhile, you know, in taking a look from another perspective. We can get stuck, because we were talking about earlier, in one perspective, and a spiritual perspective or a non-dual perspective, which of course includes all perspectives. But I think you understand what I'm saying, that just maybe, I'm denying something of myself. But a great way is to look at your life as it is in the moment. You know, how's my physical body? You know, what's going with that? How are my relationships? What is really coming up, you know, in my awareness or in my consciousness when I interact? You know, or what is my relationship really with anger? You know, or all of the richness of the spectrum of the human experience. Am I okay with all of it, or do I think or feel or know I should deny some of it? And if we're denying anything, then, you know, let's take a look, and what does it feel like to deny that? And to get very, very curious. I think curiosity is key, you know. But I really feel that some people, and this is, I think, is where it moves towards pathology, where some people will really just flat out deny that they have trauma. There's far too much self-hatred that they've internalized from the failure of their environment that they just don't want to touch. And they can be actually really wonderful people in the world and very professional, very successful. Or they could be spiritual teachers, you know, and everything in between. But our body and our environment will certainly give us clues that something is going on. Trauma, you know, at its core is perceived threat. And especially in early trauma, any severe trauma, any trauma, all traumas are severe, it is like facing death. It's like we're facing annihilation. And you can imagine, especially for infants or children, which I really feel, and I think there's a consensus with a lot of, you know, in the field today of both spirituality and psychology, where they come together, that anything that's happening in our adult life, our emotional, psychological and physiological difficulties can be traced back to our early foundational years. So as an infant or a child, if we perceive danger, and it could just be it's not even it could be by not being picked up, that I've spoken about before, and left to cry for hours, you know, or being abused, or being hit, or being screamed at, or just not being mirrored lovingly, it can be terrifying. And so that's where the disconnection happens, the dissociation. But we do that because it feels like we're about to die. And when we are on a journey of exploring and resolving trauma, one of the most common pieces that comes up with my patients and I when we're working is these places where we touch into that annihilation. And we do it together. And it can be terrifying, but if the work is organic, if the work for the person is allowed to be organic, and we're doing it gently and carefully enough, when they touch upon it, it is incredibly liberating. It's similar to in a spiritual, you know, in a meditation, where you come across this, again, articulating this is quite difficult, but coming across that space where you're about to fall into a void, and you can either, terror can come in and you can contract, and then it's like a negative void, just an empty space that's really nothing, or you can fall into hopelessness, which kind of has a taste of the similar void that you hit in early trauma. Or there's a way that, you know, hopefully you are able to let go or surrender, and that void opens up into something unimaginably brilliant and luminous with great clarity, you know, this pristine awareness. So where the trauma and spirituality, these two seeming paths, can come together as they support each other in that way. You know, so meditation, we're really, hopefully, is an embodied meditation path that I always recommend. We're coming back to the body in a very gentle way. We're cultivating mindfulness of the body, and then, you know, wider expanse of mindfulness that allows us to touch these places that we may not have been aware of before. And we're doing the same in trauma. And so if, you know, from experiencing these profound supported places in trauma of seeming annihilation, but you actually survive and come through it and feel more liberated. If you've done that in trauma work, when you come to a meditation path, it can be profoundly useful to take you to deeper and deeper states that can become traits of your being. You can sustain it and integrate it over time. So that's why I think these traditions, you know, the psychological, the more progressive psychological traditions that include the body, and the meditation traditions when they come together, can be so profound for us, for humanity at this time when there is so much suffering.